Let's turn today to John chapter 8. This is a very well-known story, often quoted not only by Christians, but even non-Christians like to quote from this from time to time, especially where Jesus said, "He who is without sin among you, let him cast the first stone at her." Obviously, having mentioned that verse, you know this is the story about the woman taken in adultery. But for all of its popularity and for all of its being well-known and all, it is a story whose authenticity has been challenged more than most. And that is because the verses that contain this story are not found in the vast majority of manuscripts of John. Whether it's Greek manuscripts or Syriac versions or whatever, the manuscript evidence for this story being a part of John's Gospel is very weak. And most scholars don't want to surrender the story and say it's not authentic, but most of them also don't want to say that it belongs to the Gospel of John, because, again, the manuscript evidence is so much against it. There are some things about the style and vocabulary of the story that are said not to really be like that of John. And also it is said that it interrupts the flow of material in John. So you've got several things working against this story being an original part of John's Gospel. The style and vocabulary are not very Johannine, as they call it, not very much like John's. It is said that it kind of interrupts the flow of thought rather unnaturally of the Gospel. And worst of all, it's absent from most of the vast majority of manuscripts don't have this story here in John's Gospel. But the story is of great antiquity, and many believe, even those who don't believe it belongs to John's Gospel, many of them believe it's a true story about Jesus, and perhaps it was part of another Gospel. For example, there are a group of manuscripts that have this story placed after Luke 21. Now, if you'll notice what Luke 21 is about, it is one of those places where the scribes and Pharisees, or the religious opponents of Christ, are bringing trick questions to him. This is basically what we have is this whole section of Luke, as well as the corresponding section in Matthew, is about the religious authorities coming to try and trap Jesus in various ways. Actually, in Luke's Gospel, it happens a little earlier than 21. It's 21 in Matthew, but in chapter 20 of Luke, we have the Pharisees trying to trap him with the question about paying taxes to Caesar. You've got the Sadducees trying to trap him with the question about the resurrection and so forth. And some believe that this story of the woman taken in adultery actually belongs to this context, that it was possibly really Luke's story, and somehow in the shifting around of manuscripts, the story got shifted over to John's Gospel, but it was really written by Luke. Now, let me tell you some of the reasons for suggesting this. One is that this story in John 8 mentions in verse 3 the scribes and the Pharisees. The term scribes and Pharisees is fairly common in the Synoptic Gospels. The Synoptic Gospels frequently make reference to the scribes and Pharisees as, two groups that are joined together in discussing them. However, in John's Gospel, apart from here, there's never any reference to the scribes and Pharisees. Scholars say this is much more like a synoptic expression, found frequently in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, whereas John has nowhere else referred to the scribes and Pharisees in that manner, though he does refer to the Pharisees elsewhere, and scribes, but to join them together, the scribes and Pharisees, is more, they say, something the Synoptic Gospels would do rather than John. In support of placing this in a different context, for example, at the end of Luke 21, where it's found in some manuscripts, instead of in John, we could point out that in this place, the geographical movements of Jesus in verses 1 and 2 of chapter 8 of John are very much like those of that last week of his life before his crucifixion. The final week, the Passion Week as it's usually called, Jesus lived in Bethany, which was on the Mount of Olives. That is, he slept there. But in the mornings, he went to Jerusalem every day and taught in the temple. And we read that this is what he did virtually every day of that Passion Week at the end of his life. That's what he's doing here. It says in verse 8, "But Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, But early in the morning, he came again to the temple. And all the people came to him, and he sat down and he taught them. So here, Jesus is apparently spending the night at the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning coming to Jerusalem to the temple to teach the people, which is what he did, we know from the Synoptic Gospels. He did that every day of the Passion Week. And therefore some say this story would fit better into that place. However, against that suggestion, we could point out that there's no reason why such geographical movements would have to be confined to the Passion Week. Jesus went to Jerusalem on many occasions. We know that some of his best friends, Mary and Martha and Lazarus, lived in Bethany on the Mount of Olives. And who knows, every time he went to Jerusalem, he may have lodged at the Mount of Olives. There's no reason why this couldn't fit here, too, it seems to me, although it would fit very naturally into that other context in Luke, perhaps some would say better. In that passage in Luke, as well as the corresponding passages in Matthew and Mark, in fact, Jesus was approached by the scribes and Pharisees about different things. He was approached about paying tribute to Caesar, which was an attempt to test him. In fact, that Passion Week was full of tests where his opponents came. And that's what is happening here. It says that when they brought the woman taken in adultery to Jesus, in verse 6, it says, "And this they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him." We know that their efforts to bring hard questions to him, to find some fault with him, to test him and find something to accuse him of, became intensified during the Passion Week. But once more, that doesn't prove that they never did it previous to the Passion Week, and therefore there's no absolute proof here that this doesn't belong to this period. So, what I can say in favor of it being Johannine and belonging at this place is that some manuscripts do have it, but most of them do not. But some of the ones that do not have it here have it somewhere else, like in Luke. On balance, almost all scholars, including very conservative scholars, would argue that this passage probably wasn't written by John, but may have been written by Luke or one of the other synoptic writers, and that it may have by some accident been shifted in the manuscripts over to this position. But that's not necessarily the case, and it's hardly important for us to decide that. That it is a true story from the life of Jesus told by one of the biblical writers, whether John or another, is acknowledged virtually by all. Even those who do not believe that John wrote this story, they do believe that it's an authentic story, honestly and truly told about something that really happened with Jesus. Whether it happened at this point chronologically or really belongs to a later time of the Passion Week is what some would debate. I bring these things up to you because virtually every commentator on John is going to make these points and raise questions as to whether John really wrote this passage. But what I would point out to you is what really matters is whether it's a true story, whether it's really something that happened and Jesus really said these things and so forth. That's, of course, what the value of the Gospels is anyway, is that they tell us true stories about Jesus. Whether it was John originally or some other who wrote this story, that it is a true story is what's important, and that we are reading of something that really did occur in the life of Jesus, and his actual reaction is the thing most important. So we're going to take it at this point, that is at the point it falls in the chronological arrangement of John, even acknowledging that it's possible that it belongs to a later period in his life, as some of the manuscripts would indicate. Really, the passage in question begins at chapter 7, verse 53. Chapter 7 ended with Nicodemus in sort of a half-courageous way, trying to take a stand for Jesus. He was not very courageous, however. You might recall that soldiers had been sent out to arrest Jesus. In John chapter 7 and verse 32, it said, "The Pharisees heard the crowd murmuring these things concerning him, and the Pharisees and the chief priests sent officers to take him." And then we read some more of the things Jesus said. And it says in verse 44 of chapter 7, "Now some of them wanted to take him, but no one laid hands on him. Then the officers came to the chief priests and Pharisees, who said to them, 'Why have you not brought him?' And the officers answered, 'No man ever spoke like this man.' Then the Pharisees answered them, 'Are you also deceived? Have any of the rulers of the Pharisees believed in him?' And then, as a matter of fact, it turns out that one of the rulers of the Pharisees speaks up. But they continue, 'But this crowd that does not know the law is accursed.' Now Nicodemus, he who came to Jesus by night, being one of them, said to them, 'Does our law judge a man before it hears him, and knows what he is doing?' They answered and said to him, 'Are you also from Galilee? Search and look, for no prophet has arisen out of Galilee.' And that is where the passage ends in most of the manuscripts. So that verse 53 that says, everyone went to his own house, but Jesus went to the Mount of Olives, is part of the disputed passage, and so all the way up through verse 11. So John 7:53 through 8:11 is the passage that is in question in some of the manuscripts. Okay? Now, let's start at chapter 8, verse 1. After this whole thing happened, and they sought to take him, but they weren't able to, and all, Jesus went that night, apparently, to the Mount of Olives. But early in the morning he came again to the temple, and all the people came to him, and he sat down and taught them. Then the scribes and Pharisees brought to him a woman caught in adultery. And when they had set her in the midst, they said to him, Teacher, this woman was caught in adultery in the very act. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned. But what do you say? But this they said, testing him, that they might have something of which to accuse him. Now, the bringing of this woman to Jesus has some interesting features. One is that they say that they caught her in the very act of adultery. Now, whenever there is an act of adultery taking place, there are two parties. And the woman must have had a man that was in the act with her when she was caught. Now, the law of Moses, to which they appeal, they say, well, Moses said we should stone this woman. The same law that says that the woman should be stoned also says the man should be stoned. Wherever the law speaks about adultery, it imposes the exact same penalty on the man involved as on the woman involved. And yet, if they caught this woman in the act, where was the man? Why hadn't they brought him to be stoned also? The question is suggested but not answered in the text, and many guesses have been made. We do not wish to put any kind of canonical authority on any of these guesses. Some have felt that this was a thing that they had actually put the woman up to, that the man who was committing adultery with her was actually one of themselves. After all, people who commit adultery aren't usually caught in the act. It's an unusual thing. And it would appear that this happened in the daytime as well, which would be, I don't know how unusual it is. I guess adultery could happen as much in the daytime as at nighttime. But people who commit adultery are usually fairly secretive. I mean, the nature of what they're doing requires it, especially when you're in a society that has the death penalty attached to the act. And yet these people happen to find this woman in the act. They do not mention her to be one of their own wives, for example. I mean, she may have been the wife of one of them, but probably not. There's no suggestion of this. So it's not that one of these guys came home and found her with another man. So how did these scribes and Pharisees happen to find a woman in the act of adultery, who, if it is true that she was in the act of adultery, it seems to be the case, it must have been in a very private, probably a very guarded situation. How did these clergymen happen to walk in on her? Well, one suggestion is that they actually framed her, or that they actually, arranged the situation. That they put some guy up to it, maybe paid him to go in there and seduce this woman, and they knew at what time and place this would be happening, so they could walk in and catch her. But why would she be targeted like this by them? I mean, was she somebody that they already had something against? Somebody that they disliked, and therefore they wanted to get her in trouble? Or it's possible that they just knew that this would be a good test question to put to Jesus, which is really what their motive was. Now, I can't say for sure that they are the ones who are guilty of bringing this woman into the situation. I mean, there may be some scenario undescribed to us where they happen by accident to come upon a woman who is in the act of adultery, but this kind of thing, as I say, doesn't usually happen unless it's the man himself coming home and finding his wife in that situation. But again, the fact that they didn't bring the man. If they caught the woman in the act of adultery, they would have also caught the man, or at least seen him. They'd know who he was. If he had escaped through the window or something, they could send someone out and get him. It would not be the case that the woman alone would be brought to justice about this. And so the fact that they caught a woman in the act of adultery, seemingly an unlikely thing to happen if it were not staged. The fact that the man that she was allegedly involved with was not brought also suggests the possibility that the man was in cahoots with them in some way, and the whole thing was arranged so that they could catch this woman in this act, or at least make such an accusation against her, It's hard to know, maybe she wasn't even in the act of adultery for all we know. That they would lie they were not above lying. We know that they put up false witnesses to accuse Jesus of things he never did, and Stephen of things he never did. So, I mean, she may not have even really been guilty. It's hard to know. But we'll take, just since we don't know others, we'll take it for granted she was guilty. And she, in fact, did commit adultery. Jesus even seems to take it for granted that she was. Because when he says, let him who is without sin cast the first stone at her, he suggests that she should be stoned. But make sure the person who stones her is better than she, Obviously, if he knew that she was in fact innocent and these were false charges brought against her, he would have said, you hypocrites, I know, but, get out of here, she's not guilty of anything. But instead, he basically affirmed that stoning her was a righteous thing to do in this case, but he challenged them as to whether they were qualified to do it, because they were not themselves any better than she. They were not without sin. But we get ahead of ourselves here. In what sense was this question a test to Jesus to give them something to accuse him of? Well, we know that the scribes and Pharisees had plenty that they could accuse him of, to their own satisfaction. They could accuse him of blasphemy. They had on more than one occasion thought him to be blaspheming. For example, when a man was lowered through the roof of a house in Galilee, in Capernaum, and Jesus said, son, your sins are forgiven. The scribes and Pharisees, remember, this man's blaspheming because he's forgiving sins. Only God can do that, so that's blasphemy. On another occasion, back in John chapter 5, when Jesus said, my Father works hitherto, and I work. Once again, they accused him of blasphemy and took up stones to stone him. And so, if they wanted to accuse him of blasphemy, they didn't need to find more charges. They already had, they could bring him to trial about those things they already were concerned about. But you see, the Jews did not have the right under Roman law to execute a man. The Sanhedrin, which was the Supreme Court of Israel, was made up of the chief priests and other Jewish elders. And the Romans, in order to keep the Jews happy, had allowed the Sanhedrin to have some jurisdiction over a lot of different areas of social life, and even to enforce penalties on petty crimes and things like that. But one area of authority that the Romans had not given to the Sanhedrin was the right to execute a man. The authority of the Sanhedrin was stopped short of that. The Jews were not permitted to kill their criminals. Roman law did not permit it. Now, what these people point out is, however, Jewish law did require it. They were bringing to Jesus a situation where Jewish law was in conflict with Roman law. Moses said this woman should be put to death. Now, what they don't point out is that Roman law, however, would forbid them from doing so. So they're bringing a situation where there's a bit of a dilemma here. Are we going to obey the Roman law or the Jewish law? That is the point of the test question. Now, the Jews, of course, could condemn Jesus of blasphemy if they wanted, but they couldn't kill him. What they needed was for him to say something that they could take him before the Roman authorities about and accuse him of wrongdoing there. That's why, on a later occasion, they asked him about the tribute money. Remember when they came to him and said, is it lawful to pay tribute to Caesar or not? This was, again, a case where they were bringing a dilemma to Jesus, where if he answered one way, he'd be opposing Roman law. That is, if he said, no, don't pay tribute to Caesar, that would be, they could accuse him of undermining Roman law because the Roman law required them to pay it. And if he said not to do it, that would make him someone they could accuse before the Romans as a troublemaker, and maybe get the Romans angry enough to kill him. That's what they wanted to do. But if he says, yes, pay tribute to Caesar, they figured that would get him into trouble with the Jews, because the Jews hated Caesar and didn't like paying tribute to Caesar, and that would point him out to be a collaborator with the enemy and lose his popular support among the Jews. And we know that on that occasion, Jesus got out of it quite magnificently by saying, well, give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's. And he ended up, basically affirming that they should pay their tribute to Caesar, but he pointed out to them that all they need to give to Caesar is the coin that has his own face on it. If it has Caesar's face, it must be Caesar's. So give him what's his, and give God what's his. The irony about this is that later on, when the Jews did bring Jesus before the Sanhedrin, and they did accuse him there of blasphemy, and decided that he is worthy of death, they then had to take Jesus to Pilate. with some totally different charges, because they knew Pilate would not care to put a man to death for blaspheming the Jewish God, which is what the Sanhedrin had condemned him for. So they brought totally trumped-up charges, and when they brought Jesus to Pilate, they said, this man is perpetrating sedition against Caesar, saying that people shouldn't pay tribute to Caesar. They actually brought these charges against Jesus, that he was saying that people shouldn't pay tribute to Caesar. That's the opposite of what he actually said. So when they couldn't hang him on his own words, they just fabricated words and pretended like he'd said them. You know, I mean, he said things that the Romans couldn't charge him with, but when he didn't say those things that they could use to accuse him, they just made up things and claimed that he said them, even, in fact, saying the opposite of what he said and attributing it to him. Well, this was a similar kind of situation, because the law of Moses said, stone this woman. The law of the Romans did not permit the Jews to take matters into their own hands for capital crimes, and I don't believe the Romans executed adulterers. Hardly. Their emperors were adulterers and homosexuals and so forth. I mean, sexual crimes were not capital crimes under the Roman law. Therefore, this was a perfect way of getting Jesus to have to take a stand either for the Roman law against Moses, in which case, of course, if he said, yes, stone her, don't stone her, he'd be, going along with what the Romans required, but he'd be accused of undermining Moses, which would be a bad deal in terms of his image among the Jews. On the other hand, if he said, do stone her, and supported the law of Moses, then they could take him to Pilate and say, well, this guy's trying to rabble-rouse, trying to get people to execute adulterers, which the Romans don't permit us to do, and therefore they could accuse him before the Romans, just as if he had said, don't pay tribute to Caesar. So this was just the same kind of test that the tribute money test was. Both of them were trying to get Jesus into a trap, where he would either have to get himself in trouble with the Romans, which they'd like for him to do, because the Romans could kill him, the Jews couldn't, and they wanted to kill him. So he'd either, one choice would be to get him in trouble with the Romans. The other choice would be to get him in trouble with the Jews. And if he got in trouble with the Jews, if the popular Jewish rabble didn't love him anymore, he would cease to be a problem to the Sanhedrin. So in either way, they win. It looked to them like a win-win situation when they asked him about the tribute money, and here when they asked him about stoning this woman caught in the act of adultery. Now, Jesus didn't answer immediately here. When it came to the tribute money, Jesus answered quite quickly. Here he didn't. Instead, he acted as if he didn't even hear them initially. He stooped down, it says in verse 6, and wrote on the ground. He was in the temple, so this would be the dust on the temple floor. He wrote with his finger, as though he did not hear. Now this last line, as though he did not hear, is absent from many of the manuscripts. But the point is, he wrote something on the floor of the temple. This and the similar statement in verse 8, again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. These are the only two places in the Bible that ever refer to Jesus writing anything. In fact, we might wonder whether he even knew how to write, if not for a passage like this. We know he knew how to write because he wrote something on the temple floor. Amazingly, he never wrote a book. Although his disciples wrote books, he didn't write a book. We don't know that he wrote anything except these words on the temple floor. And therefore, that would make them, we would think, sacred words, the only words ever written by Jesus. And yet, the only words he ever wrote, we don't even know what they were. The disciples did not bother to record them, which is amazing, really. They record what Jesus said, but when Jesus wrote this down, whatever he wrote, there is absolutely no attempt made to record for us what he wrote. Now, there are several theories about what he wrote on the temple floor. One theory is that he was just doodling. That is, he didn't write anything at all in particular. He was just graphically ignoring them. I mean, like not giving them the time of the day. After all, some of the manuscripts do read, as ours does here, he wrote as if he didn't hear them. It's like he was ignoring them and just kind of doodling on the, like kids will doodle on a misty window or something, to draw pictures or hieroglyphics or something. I mean, just kind of doodling in the dust. And the reason we're not told what he wrote is because he didn't write anything in particular. What he wrote wasn't really words at all. He was just kind of biding his time and acting like he hadn't heard them. That's one theory. But there are other theories too. And it does seem that his doodling on or his writing on the temple floor there has something to do with the impact his words in verse 7 had on the people. And there are a number of theories. One theory is that Jesus, and I do not hold this theory, by the way, but many preachers have presented it as a possibility, that he wrote down the names of each of the scribes and Pharisees that were there, coupled with a list of their sins. Now, I don't think this is likely. It seems like if he did something as dramatic as that, something that would require, a miraculous word of knowledge to be given, it would be a tremendous demonstration of his prophetic powers, that would be the kind of thing John would have mentioned, or whoever wrote this. I mean, a lot of times we're told in the Gospels, whether John or the Synoptic Gospels, that Jesus, knowing their thoughts, said, and it tells us, that he made it clear that he knew what people were thinking, that he got a revelation about things that they hadn't communicated to him. And if in fact he was writing down their names, which he would not have naturally probably known, and their individual sins, which obviously he would not naturally have known, but he'd have to have that by a word of knowledge, then it seems like that would be a striking miracle, striking enough that probably John or whoever wrote this would have mentioned it. He wrote down their names and their sins, and that would give explanation of the fact that when he then turned to them and said, now, whoever among you is without sin, cast the first stone. He'd just written out what their sins were. None of them could cast a stone. It makes a dramatic theory that kind of makes the story have an interesting twist to it. But I don't think it likely. As I said, it seems to me that if he did something that dramatic, something that supernatural, that it would have been mentioned as something more than just stooping down and writing with his finger on the ground without mentioning what it was. Another possibility is that he may have written down some scriptures on the floor. Scriptures that would in fact condemn some of the behaviors of those that were standing there accusing the woman. I mean, scriptures about maybe greed or scriptures about hypocrisy, things from the Old Testament where, they didn't see themselves as sinners. They saw this woman as a sinner. But he could have written down some scriptures from Deuteronomy or from Exodus or from maybe the prophets, which would point to their own sins. Not so much that he enumerated their individual sins by name, but that he could have written down some scriptural words, which as they read what he saw, it would show them that, oh yeah, they too were sinners. So that when he then stood up and said, he that is without sin among you, cast the first stone at her, it would be, in essence, they were quoting Moses to him. Moses said we should stone her. That his writing may have in fact been quoting back scripture to them as well that would condemn them as much. Once again, I don't know that too much weight could be put on this theory simply because Jesus could have as easily said it as written it. In fact, in most cases, that's exactly what he did. When the Pharisees frequently were accusing Jesus or the disciples of things they were doing wrong, and when Jesus wished to show them that they were doing things even more or equally unscriptural, he would simply verbally quote the scriptures to them. Have not heard what David did? Go and learn what this means. I will have mercy and not sacrifice, or whatever. He will. Does it not say in your law, I said to your gods? Whenever he wants to appeal to the Old Testament to show them their hypocrisy and their own guilt, he generally would just quote it out loud. We don't have any other case in the Bible where he wrote it on the temple floor, nor does it necessarily mean, or seem more appropriate, for example, for him to write on the floor in this case instead of just saying it to them. So I don't know if that's what he did or not. It's possible he was just doodling and didn't write anything in particular. And if he did write something more specific, it's simply not told what it is, which might make all guessing about it a fool's errand, really, because, obviously, even if we knew what he wrote, we might have to decide, like the writer did, it wasn't worth mentioning. Whatever he wrote, it wasn't important enough to record for the writer to record it. It may not have had anything to do with the story if he wrote words at all. Or if it did, it wasn't somehow so essential to know, or else the writer would have told us what it was. As easily as telling us he stooped down and wrote on the floor with his finger, he could have said, and he wrote these words, or he wrote down this kind of information. But we're not told that. That's one of the mysteries of the passage. But it's really one of the marks of the authenticity of the passage as well. When you make up a story, and you're trying to make it up like it's a true story, yet the very fiction of it comes out in the fact, generally speaking, that you don't include details that have no value to the story, that don't forward the story. A made-up story, to make a point, usually focuses on the things that carry forward the point. A true story, however, just tells what happened, even if some of the things that happened don't seem to be that relevant to the point. And Jesus writing on the floor is not made out in the story to be a relevant point. And since we don't know what he wrote, or if he even wrote any actual words, or just doodled, we can probably assume that what he wrote is not an essential part of the point he was making. Or if it is, it's not manifestly so. And so we can simply observe the fact that he wrote on the floor without necessarily having to speculate what he wrote, if anything. Yes, Judy? No, only twice here in this passage. Yeah, once is in verse 6. Yeah, in verse 6 where it says he wrote on the ground, and then verse 8, it mentions again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. Yeah. No, just in this place. And apart from these two verses, we never read of Jesus ever writing anything. Now, there is a scripture in the Old Testament, probably not relevant, but one theory is that Jesus did write down the names of those people standing around there. And there is a scripture in the Old Testament about those Jews who would be judged, as it says, their names shall be written in the earth. It's in Isaiah, I believe, but I don't remember the passage exactly. But with reference to the Jews who were under God's wrath, it said something about their names shall be written in the earth, which perhaps means as opposed to in heaven. Jesus said his disciples' names are written in heaven. But I don't even remember the exact passage in the Old Testament that says that. But some people thinking of that passage think maybe Jesus wrote their names there on the ground, in the earth, as it were, as men who were to stand God's judgment. Once again, that's kind of an esoteric theory, and I mean, when you just think about it, whoever wrote the story deliberately didn't tell us what Jesus wrote on the ground. And that's either because he didn't write anything, and therefore there's nothing to report, or whatever he wrote was not important to know for the story. Which seems a strange possibility, because I'd like to know what Jesus wrote. And it's funny that the only time Jesus ever wrote anything, he wrote it in a non-permanent place, and the next time people walked through it, shuffled that dust, what he wrote was no longer there. But I guess that's because Jesus does his permanent writing on our hearts. He didn't come to give a written law like Moses did, but to write his law on our hearts. And Paul himself even said that though he himself wrote letters, books of our Bible, really the most important epistle Paul wrote was on the hearts of the Corinthians. He said, or Christians in general, of course, we said it to the Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, where he says in 2 Corinthians 3:3, you are manifestly an epistle of Christ, ministered by us, written not with ink, but by the Spirit of the living God, not on tables of stone, but on the tablets of flesh, that is, of the heart. The Corinthians and the writing on their hearts, the change of their hearts, in other words, is the principal epistle of God and of Paul that is of value. Paul wrote other epistles, but the most important writing is that which is on the heart. And so Jesus apparently didn't write anything that was ever preserved for us to know. Now, after he initially wrote on the ground, verse 7 says, so when they continued asking him, so they didn't just ask him once, they just kept asking him, and he acted like he didn't hear them initially. It's like the Syrophoenician woman who kept following him and begging him to do something for her daughter, and he just ignored her for a long time until the disciples finally said, send her away. And then he finally answered. I guess Jesus was one of these guys who, I was talking to Bill yesterday, how he doesn't let the telephone interrupt what he's doing. My wife is that way too. I'm too curious when people, phone's ringing, I want to know who it is. And also, I don't want to be rude. Not that it's rude not to answer the phone. If you're busy doing something else, maybe it's rude for someone to be calling and interrupting you. I mean, the telephone has brought new ethics into human society. And, if someone's home and they don't answer when I'm calling, I think they're being rude. On the other hand, if I'm busy doing something important and someone with a petty thing calls me, they're rude for interrupting me. So I don't know who's being rude, but I guess I'm sensitive about being rude. So if someone asks me a question or rings the phone or something, I always want to answer right away. Jesus wasn't that way. He probably would let the phone ring if he had something else he was doing more important. These people would be standing there saying, well. He's just acting like he doesn't even hear them, just right in the dust. And finally, when he gets around to it, he answers them. In verse 7, he raised himself up and said to them, "He who is without sin among you, let him throw a stone at her first." Now, of course, Jesus' statement was calculated to deliver her from being stoned, but we shouldn't miss the point that he affirmed that the stoning of an adulteress is a just and right thing. He did not care to execute her himself, as he mentioned later in the story, and he didn't think that the people accusing her were worthy to do it either. But that doesn't mean she had not done something worthy of death. Jesus did not here lighten the severity of the crime and the sin of adultery or of its just consequences. In a sense, Jesus affirmed capital punishment here, at least one side of it. You see, there's two sides of capital punishment. One is capital punishment is valid if A, someone has done something worthy of death, and B, there's some duly appointed authority that's authorized to execute the person who's done something worthy of death. What Jesus affirmed here is that she had in fact done something worthy of death. The problem was her accusers were so hypocritical, they were not authorized, they would have been quite unjust to be the ones to execute her, because they too were sinners. Now, his statement, as it stands, would seem, of course, to kind of nullify the law of Moses. Because the law of Moses, which required certain people to be put to death, certainly the people who would put them to death were also sinners. The magistrates and the communities that were to stone idolaters and adulterers and blasphemers and so forth in the law of Moses, certainly the executioners in those cases were not sinless individuals. And if Jesus is saying that a person who's going to execute someone else must be absolutely sinless, then in fact he was undermining the law of Moses. Because Moses had authorized people who couldn't have been regarded as sinless, since no man is sinless, to execute people who did certain crimes. And not every sin is worthy of death of the same sort. That is, of a judicial civil penalty being brought upon them. Of course, all sin is worthy of death in the sense of eternal death and spiritual death, and all sin alienates from God. But some crimes are worthy of death in the civil sense of civil law being executed, criminal sense. Other sins are not. For example, it is a sin to look at a woman with lust, but it's a sin to commit adultery with her. Jesus said, essentially, in God's sight, they're equally bad sins, but society in Moses' day was allowed to execute a person for committing adultery, but certainly not for, they weren't told to execute people for looking with lust. And likewise, for murder, a person was to be executed. But Jesus said, if you're angry at your brother without a cause, it's the same thing. But under the law, they didn't execute people who were angry. There are some sins which are equally bad in the eyes of God, but not, I guess, equally destructive to human society, and therefore God didn't impose civil penalties against some of them. Now, if Jesus simply said, he that is without sin, let him be the first to cast stone at her, thus, meaning any sin, if you've committed any sin at all, you cannot stone her, then he has nullified the law of Moses, which did command that such people be stoned, and did not make the requirement that the people doing the stoning be absolutely sinless people. That requirement was imposed that no one could stone anybody, because there are no sinless people. Therefore, many scholars believe that his statement should be translated more like, whoever is without this sin, let him be the first to cast a stone at her. There may be something about the Greek, I'm not a scholar enough to know, but many commentators have said what Jesus actually was saying is, whoever has not committed this sin. Now, that would change things a bit, you see, because everyone has committed some sins. Everyone's been proud at some time or another. Everyone's been, unkind at one time or another. These are sins. Everyone's gotten angry at one time or another. No one is without sin in that sense. But certainly not everyone is an adulterer. And if Jesus' statement was basically, whoever is without this sin, let him be the first to cast stone at her, and all of them bowed out, and none of them actually stoned her, it would suggest that he knew they were all guilty of this sin. And rather than him saying that an executioner must be a sinless person, he would be saying rather an executioner must not be guilty of the same crime that the victim is, or that the criminal is. That is, the criminal is a criminal, not a victim. But the point is, if a person was being sent to the electric chair for being a mass murderer, but the executioner happened to be a guy who secretly was out doing murders and bank robberies on the side, it would be obviously an unjust situation. Although the person being executed deserves to be executed, the person who's the executioner is equally deserves to be executed. And many people feel that that's what exactly Jesus was saying. Whoever is without this sin, whoever is not guilty of this same sin, that is adultery, let him be the first to cast a stone at her. Now, I've heard that interpretation of this passage from my youth, and I must say that my first reactions to it were negative. For one thing, it seemed to me that Jesus would be taking a tremendous chance here. Because if what he is really saying, in words that they would understand this way, is, if you are not an adulterer yourself, go ahead and stone her. Well, then, he's taking the chance that one of them there might actually end up stoning her, because who would think that all the scribes and Pharisees would actually be adulterers? Now, some might say, well, if to look at a woman with lust is adultery, then everyone's guilty. Well, that may be true, but the Pharisees would not necessarily accept Jesus' teaching that looking at a woman with lust after is adultery. Therefore, it wouldn't have quite the teeth on their conscience that this apparently did. His statement really got to their consciences, we're told. It says in verse 9, then those who heard it, being convicted by their conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the oldest even to the last, and Jesus was left alone and the woman standing in the midst. These people were convicted by what he said. Now, if he said, whoever is without this sin, meaning adultery, let him cast the first stone, and they were all convicted in their conscience, it's not likely that they were convicted for looking at a woman with lust, because the Jews simply were not convicted about that. It was Jesus who taught that as a radical new teaching, that such looking is tantamount to adultery. The Jews would not have that, the ones who rejected his teaching would not be concerned about that. The only way they would be concerned is if they were all actual physical adulterers. Now, that's why I had trouble with this interpretation for a long time with, because I thought, well, how could it be that all the scribes and Pharisees in that crowd had actually committed physical adultery in the past? Certainly physical adultery wouldn't have been that common among religious people. And yet, it's possible that it was. I've read some places that adultery was not uncommon, even among the religious. The Talmud, which we have now, which is the codification of the elders' traditions, actually, in the Talmud you can read some really terrible stuff. There's all kinds of loopholes for sexual sin. For example, and this is, most of it is not even worthy, it's despicable to repeat, but child sexual molestation, if the child is under 3 years old, was considered not a sin in the Talmud, in the Jewish traditions. Not the law of God. Of course, God would condemn it, but the traditions of the rabbis permitted it. And there were a whole lot of loopholes and various categories where they allowed sexual sin among themselves without calling it sexual sin, because of this, the person with whom they did it was in a special category, and therefore it didn't count. And for that reason, it may be that there was a great deal of sexual immorality going on, even among the Jews, even among the religious Jews. If you look over at Romans chapter 2, in verse 17, Paul said, indeed, you are called a Jew, and rest in the law, and you make your boast in God. And you know his will, and you approve of the things that are excellent, being instructed out of the law. And are confident that you yourself are a guide to the blind, a light to those who sit in darkness, an instructor of the foolish, a teacher of babes, having the form of knowledge and truth in the law. You, therefore, who teach another, do you not teach yourself? You who preach that a man should not steal, do you steal? You who say, do not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? Now, this is another passage I used to have trouble with, because Paul was speaking to Jews, religious Jews who boasted in the law. and believe themselves to be an upright example of, God's will and a light to the Gentiles and so forth. And to these Jews, Paul says, do you steal? Do you commit adultery? And obviously his argument would lose all force if they could answer honestly, no, I don't. The whole point that Paul's making is, you do, don't you? You condemn Gentiles for sinning, but you steal too, don't you? You condemn Gentiles for committing adultery, but you commit it too, don't you? Now, if that's not what he's saying, then his argument is meaningless. He's obviously trying to instill conviction in his readers over the fact that they do the same things. In fact, he says that in the opening verse of Romans 2. Therefore you are inexcusable, O man, whoever you are who judge, for in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself, for you who judge practice the same things. He just gets more explicit in verses 21 and 22. Says, you who say that people shouldn't steal, do you steal? You who say people shouldn't commit adultery, do you commit adultery? And the reason this often bothered me is I thought, well, certainly most Jews in Paul's day didn't commit adultery and didn't steal. They lived by the law, did they not? However, who would know that better, Paul or me? Paul lived at that time. He had been a Pharisee himself. He knew intimately the moral character of the men of that class and of the Jews in general. And if he, with that intimate knowledge of the moral lives and character of his fellow Jews, could say, do you steal? Do you commit adultery? And know in his heart that most of them would have to answer, yes, I do. Then Paul is really telling us a great deal that we might not otherwise know about the moral character of the Jews of that time. They did commit adultery, apparently a great deal, and steal and do things like that. And they knew it. If you'd press them about it, if you confront them about it, they couldn't deny it. That being the case, it is possible that every scribe and Pharisee, possibly most Jews, most Jewish men at least, may have in fact been guilty of adultery. Now you might say, well, if these men who brought the woman, had actually committed adultery, how could they even be so hypocritical as to bring a woman with that charge? Remember, they didn't bring a man. They brought the woman, but not the man. The Jews thought that the male could get away with things the woman could not. And they were all males. So they may have allowed themselves indulgences which they would stone a woman for doing. We know, for example, in Jewish thinking, a man could have several wives, but a woman couldn't have more than one husband. That a man could divorce his wife, but a woman couldn't divorce her husband no matter what he did. It's quite clear that in their thinking there was a definite double standard with reference to the sexual rights of men and the sexual rights of women. And that seems to be evidenced in the fact that they could bring a woman whom they allegedly caught in the act of adultery, which means there was a man present, but they didn't bring him. They let the man off. They showed no interest in punishing the man, but they were interested in punishing the woman. Therefore, it is entirely possible, and Jesus knew their hearts, and Paul certainly knew the heart of the Jew as well, and both Jesus and Paul may well be giving us a clue here that most Jewish men did overstep the law against adultery, but they, in their own hearts, they vindicated themselves, they justified themselves, perhaps by some of the traditions of the elders that allowed for sexual misconduct in certain cases, perhaps by appeal to the fact that they could have more than one wife, therefore they should be able to have more than one woman, whatever. I don't know how they would have justified it. We don't have information about that here in the Bible, but there certainly is an indicator in Paul's writing to them in Romans 2, to the Jews, that they did, in fact, commit adultery often enough to be convicted when he asked them, do you commit adultery? And likewise, Jesus may have been asking, anyone here who has not himself committed adultery, let him stone this woman for the act of adultery. That could only convict them in their hearts if, in fact, they had committed adultery. But it would be a perfectly reasonable thing for him to say. And while it hadn't come to their minds on their own, once mentioned, it would certainly commend itself as a reasonable criticism of them. That they were in fact asking this woman to be stoned for something that they themselves do. In fact, for all we know, maybe one of themselves had even been the man who had done it with her when they caught her. We don't know. I don't want to read too much into it, but that is a possibility. Now, if on the other hand, we want to allow that Jesus is saying, let him who has not committed adultery throw the first stone at this adulteress. But we don't want to believe that every one of those Jews had in fact been guilty of the physical act of adultery. There's another way that he could have meant this to them. Let him that is without this sin. He could mean this actual instance. Let everyone who's not an accomplice in this sin that this woman has committed on this occasion be the first to cast a stone at her. Now, this would imply what I suggested earlier, that they had staged the whole thing. Sure, she was guilty of adultery, but so were they, even if they hadn't physically committed adultery, in staging this whole thing, in being complicit in this sin. They were as guilty as she was. And therefore, if they thought she should be stoned for this sin, well, their own complicity in this same matter should condemn them as well, enough that they couldn't stone her. And that is a possibility. He that is without this sin could possibly imply this, not the general category of adultery, but this case of adultery, this one case that they were accusing this woman of. They could have been co-conspirators in bringing this whole sin about, and therefore they were a whole part of the complex of this sin's guilt, and it fell on them as well as her. That's another possible meaning. In any case, whatever his meaning was and however they understood it, they knew themselves to be disqualified by it. So whatever he said struck the heart. It pierced them at the heart. They knew that his words were directed and rightly directed toward them, that they were not without sin. They were not without this sin or without sin or whatever. They were truly unqualified to condemn her when they were as guilty as she. Now, if that is Jesus' meaning, then his statement would not forbid all capital punishment today. There are Christians who believe that capital punishment is wrong. I'm not one of them. I believe capital punishment is right. I believe it is just. I believe it's holy. I believe that God's law never gave any unjust commands and so forth. And since God commanded that certain people be put to death, it must be righteous. It must be a right thing to do in many cases. But that doesn't mean we are to execute people. The question is, can anyone do it? It's one thing to say that capital punishment is a just penalty for certain crimes. It's another question, is anyone alive qualified to be an executioner? And I've read a book by a person who didn't believe in capital punishment, and he quoted Jesus here, let him that is without sin cast the first stone. And he said what Jesus was essentially saying is that even though people do things worthy of death, everybody has done things worthy of death in God's sight, and therefore no one can righteously condemn them. But you see, I don't think that could be correct. I don't think that could be what Jesus is saying. Because if that's what he meant, then he'd be eliminating all magistrates, all law enforcement, all criminal penalties. Because essentially he'd be saying, listen, you're a criminal in the sight of God too, so who are you to punish a criminal? The fact is, everyone's a criminal in the sight of God, but still there are people ordained of God, Paul said in Romans 13. They're ordained of God to be executioners of God's wrath on those who do wickedness. And they do not bear the sword in vain, Paul says. The sword was used for executing people. Paul himself was executed by the Roman sword at a time later than that, probably about 10 years after he wrote those words. So, certainly Paul didn't understand that Jesus had eliminated all civil penalties for criminal action, and that Jesus swept away the authority of governments to enforce laws and to punish criminals. And if someone would say, well, okay, but yeah, we need to enforce the laws and not punish criminals, but capital punishment is what Jesus ruled out here, because he talked about stoning her, putting her to death. However, to say that capital punishment is less just than some other kind of punishment would be a hard thing to prove. If a person has done things worthy of having his hand slapped, then his hand should be slapped. If he's done things worthy of having his eye put out, then his eye should be put out, according to the law. If he's done things worthy of him having to make restitution, then he should make restitution. But if he's done things worthy of death, then death is the just thing, the just penalty, and anything less than that is not just. And if God says that certain crimes are worthy of death, the reason for it is because if persons who do them are allowed to live, they will continue doing them and victimizing people in a big way. The crimes that God forbade are crimes that, when left unchecked, corrupt and destroy society and eventually bring society into gross abominations and so forth. And God never imposed capital punishment on any crime that was not worthy of death. And for that reason, if somebody has done something worthy of death, and God says these people deserve to die, it's because if they don't die, it's unmerciful to the rest of society. You're being merciful to the criminal, but unmerciful to the innocent, to the victim. Now, someone might say, well, you don't have to turn the person loose again. I mean, you could give them life imprisonment. Yeah, but who's going to pay for that? Again, the citizens, the victims, the innocent. The innocent are going to feed and house this guy at their expense. That's making perpetual victims of them. He not only is now a guy who's committed murder, he's now robbing. He's taking from their pockets a free meal and a free house in jail from them. All of this, I think, when things are thought through, we have to assume that if people do things worthy of death, the right thing for government to do is kill them. If they do things worthy of lesser crimes, lesser penalties, I should say, then the right thing for government to do is to dish out those lesser penalties. And some people say, well, if God is doing to others, you should have them do it to you. Would you want people to kill you? Well, that's a little beside the point. A criminal usually does want to get away with his crimes. But that doesn't mean that it's a loving thing to let him do so. If it was, God would let us all get away with our sins. I mean, God always does a loving thing. And if it was loving to let every sinner go unpunished for his sins, then God would never there'd never be a hell. There'd never be a judgment day. God would just let everybody go free because that's what they want. But the loving thing is to maintain, justice and righteousness, not just for the criminal, but for humanity at large. And after all, if we don't like to execute criminals because that's not nice, they don't want to be executed, well, do they want to go to jail? I'll bet they don't want to do that either. I'll bet they don't want to pay fines either. In fact, I'll bet they don't want to pay any penalty for their crimes. And any penalty for any crime then would be an unloving thing to impose because, after all, they don't want to do that. They don't want to go to jail. They don't want to pay a fine. Therefore, penalties shouldn't exist because it's unloving. It's not nice. But when it comes to love, of course, the teaching of the Bible about love is more complex than just sort of have a sentimental, good vibes feeling toward everybody. Love has got to be of sterner stuff than that. Love has got to take into consideration the well-being of more people than just the one person. And it is not unloving to do justice to someone. And if someone invites the death penalty by doing something that they know deserves it, then to give them what they deserve may not be the most merciful thing you can do to them, but it's not an unjust thing either. And the government is not there to extend mercy. The church is there to extend mercy. The government is there to be an executioner of God's wrath on those who do evil. Now, I therefore do not believe that Jesus' words here condemn capital punishment any more than they condemn any criminal penalties of any kind. I mean, in a sense, if these people came and accused this woman of having ripped someone off and said that the law of Moses says she should pay back fivefold, and Jesus pointed out that the person that was ripped off had first ripped her off and should pay her back fivefold, and therefore the deal's square, and the thing should be thrown out of court, as it were. That doesn't mean that courts have no use. It just means that this is a big sham. That this is, the people making the accusation are just as guilty as the person they're accusing, and this thing should be thrown out of court. And that's what Jesus was basically doing. He's throwing this out of court. He wasn't saying courts have no use. He's saying that this is a travesty of justice. You bring a woman who deserves to die, and you want to kill her, but you deserve to die as much as she does because you've done the same crime. I'm throwing this out of court. You brought it to me. I'm the judge. You want a judgment from me? I'm saying it's contempt of court. It's irreverency toward the whole idea of justice. So I think that's what he's doing. You people, you don't have the first right to bring such charges against a woman like this. And they realized it. And therefore they all kind of shrunk away like dogs with their tails between their legs and their heads down. And after they were gone, Jesus was left alone. The woman was still standing there. And when Jesus raised himself up and saw that no one was there but the woman. Oh, by the way, I didn't point this out. It says so in the text, but I kind of skipped over it. When they first asked Jesus the question, he stooped down and wrote on the ground in the dust with his finger. Then when they kept pressing him, he stood up, faced them, answered them. He that is without sin be the first to cast stone at her. Then he stooped down again. He was writing in the dust, paying no attention to them as they all kind of skulked away. I mean, he was just kind of acting like they weren't there, and before long they weren't. And then he looked up, it says, and that's what we see here in verse 10. When Jesus had raised himself up and saw no one but the woman, he said to her, Woman, where are those accusers of yours? Has no one condemned you? And she said, No one, Lord. And Jesus said to her, Neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. Now, why didn't he condemn her? We don't know. We know that the Bible says in the book of Revelation, when God judges the people that are there described, that he judges them for their fornications and their idolatries and their sorceries and their thefts and so forth. And certainly adultery is part of fornication. I mean, God does judge sinners. On the day of judgment, I don't think every adulterer can confidently walk up before the throne of God, even though they've never repented, and say, well, I read a story in the Bible that Jesus said he didn't condemn that woman who committed adultery, so he can't condemn me either. I think there must be some special circumstance here, although we're not told what it is. And I don't know what it is. But I guess I'm inclined to assume that Jesus saw that she was repentant of her sin. We know that that's the only basis upon which God or Jesus today forgives sins, is that people repent and believe in him. Now she, of course, was not able to believe in his death and resurrection because she didn't know anything about it yet. It hadn't happened yet. She couldn't plead the blood, as it were, because she didn't know anything about that yet. She couldn't do some of the things we can do. She didn't have an advocate with the Father, Jesus Christ the righteous, as we do. She didn't have a great high priest up there. I mean, some of the things, if we sin, we can look back on the cross and the blood and the ascension of Christ and his intercession for us, and we can plead all those things. But she didn't know any of those things and hadn't done anything. She did refer to him as Lord, although it's possible that had no more meaning than sir, because the word Lord, kurios, there can mean something like that. It can mean master or it can mean sir. In this case, though, she may have been professing his lordship in the more important sense. But one thing is common to all forgiveness, and that is a person humbly repenting of their sins. We don't read of her repenting, but that doesn't mean it didn't happen. Jesus certainly knew whether she did or not. Now, it's also possible that in saying, I don't condemn you, he might not have been saying she was forgiven. That is, if she had not repented, he might not be saying, well, that's okay, you're on the road to heaven. He might have just been saying, I'm the only one here who's never sinned and therefore can throw the stones at you, but I don't choose to do so. I'll leave you to your fate on the judgment day. You can, if you repent between now and then, good for you. If you don't, then you'll have to answer for this later, but I'm not going to stone you now. It's possible that his words had that meaning, conceivably. And, when he said, go and sin no more, he'd just be saying, but you may not get off as easy next time, so you might want to reform your ways. I mean, it's hard to say. We always picture him as just kind of forgiving her sin, and she's on the road to heaven, she's a Christian now, and so forth. And I suppose that's probably how we should understand it. I believe she probably was repentant. She probably, in calling him Lord, meant that in the truest sense of the word. And when he says, I don't condemn you, that he would be saying something like to the man who wears Lord through the roof, your sins are forgiven you. Though I do say that we don't read of her repenting, and it is possible for his word simply to mean, well, they aren't stoning you. That leaves only me to stone you, and I'm not going to stone you either. But that doesn't mean I think you're okay. That doesn't mean I think you did the right thing. And you better be more careful. Don't do that again. You may have to get stoned next time. You know, I got you off this time, you know, but don't do it again. I could see it either way, to tell you the truth. I guess my preference is probably like most people's, to see this as a case where she actually was forgiven of her sin and kind of came to be a Christian and saved and all that. And that certainly is probably more popular and a very real possible way to understand that. One thing that's important to note is that Jesus can acknowledge sin to be sin and acknowledge sin to be worthy of death, but still choose not to condemn. That's his prerogative as God. Now, I believe it's his prerogative mainly because of his death. Although he had not died yet, when he forgave people of their sins prior to his death, I believe it's probably based on the fact that he was going to die for their sins. I mean, even in the Old Testament, Abraham was imputed righteous by his faith. Therefore, he was of necessity forgiven of whatever sins he had committed, even though Jesus hadn't died yet. But in all likelihood, he was forgiven on the basis of God anticipating what Jesus would do for him. Here also, Jesus may have forgiven on that basis. But it's possible for Jesus to forgive sin without lessening in one degree the magnitude of sin. I mean, he had indicated that for her to be stoned was reasonable. You know, I mean, let him that is without sin go ahead and stone her. She deserves it. Her sin was that bad. And he did not give her any leniency, to keep it up. Go and sin no more. He forbade her to sin anymore like this. So he wasn't just saying, hey, I'm on your side in this deal. At one level he wasn't condemning her, but he certainly condemned her action. He certainly indicated that what she did was sin, and he forbade her to do it anymore, and he had indicated earlier that it was just as bad as Moses said it is. It's worthy of being stoned to death. He just chose not to condemn her. And it's important for, I think, us in having the mind of Christ to be able to acknowledge that people do things which we will in no way endorse, and which as Christians we have to speak up for God's values on these things, but without condemning people. Obviously, abortion and homosexuality are a couple of issues that are large on people's minds these days. I mean, Christians have been pretty good in some quarters about condemning these things without condemning people. I've known some Christians who can condemn homosexuality but are still very open to homosexual people and willing to associate with them and witness to them and serve them and so forth. Likewise, people at crisis pregnancy centers and stuff, they obviously condemn abortion, but they don't condemn unwed mothers, and they try to help them out. I think that's a very Christ-like approach. Unfortunately, there are some Christians who they not only condemn those sins, but they see themselves as the enemies of those who commit them. People who shoot abortion doctors, for example. Now, does an abortion doctor deserve to die? I think so. I think he does. I mean, if abortion is murder, and I believe it is, then a murderer deserves to die. An abortion doctor deserves to die. And I think Christians have often not been very consistent in the way they argue. The whole pro-life community has, although they hate abortion, they have come out with one voice to condemn these men who shoot abortion doctors. And I also believe it's wrong to shoot abortion doctors, but I think the pro-life community has found themselves in a hard spot because they have not understood that the role of government and the role of the church are two different things. Because they will approve, for example, of, for example, I heard a discourse on a Christian station when one of these abortion doctors was shot, and a caller was saying, yeah, Christians shouldn't shoot abortionists. And the host said, well, why not? And they say, well, it's not our place to take the law into our hands. And the host said, well, what if you were walking down the street and you saw a child being beaten nearly to death? Would you intervene? Even though it's the law, it's the police, should do that. But if they're not there or if they're not doing it, would you intervene? He said, yeah. He said, well, why wouldn't you do that for an unborn child too? And the caller, didn't have an answer. But of course, the answer certainly must be that even though we admit that there are times when the government should intervene and does not, it's not our place to take lethal force into our hands and to ultimately condemn a person to death. I do think we should intervene. I would do so short of using lethal force, for example. If I saw someone being mugged or whatever, I feel like I should intervene. I don't feel I should just stand by and pray. I think I should get involved and do what I can to rescue somebody who's in danger. But that's a different thing than saying I would shoot the mugger or something. Now, of course, in the case of shooting abortion doctors, they do deserve to die. But really, for a person to shoot the abortion doctor isn't really redressing the injustice. The real murderer is the mother who's going to get the abortion. The doctor's just a hitman. You know, he's just being paid to do the hit. But the mother is the murderer. She's the one who's deciding to kill the baby, and the abortion doctor couldn't touch it if the mother didn't ask him to, didn't pay him to. The real culprit there is the mother, but to shoot the mother would be stupid because you don't save the baby that way, you kill the baby with the mother. You know, this situation is such that God has certainly arranged it in such a way that we cannot redress the injustice by killing people. The person who deserves it most would be the mother who wants to murder her baby, but you can't kill her without killing the baby too, which obviously we wouldn't want to do either. And, so in our frustration we kill the abortion doctor. But the mother would just go to another abortion doctor and kill the baby anyway. The baby's, you don't rescue a baby that way. You just vent your wrath. And many Christians have a lot of wrath because they're so frustrated that there's so little justice being done in this area. But you see, we can admit that abortion doctors doing things worthy of death without saying, I condemn you, I shoot you. You deserve to die, the government should do it, if they're not going to do it, I'm going to do it, is simply not the role of the Christian. And to condemn homosexuals. Now, to condemn their behavior is truly correct. Homosexuality is an abomination to God. It's worthy of death. And we can admit all those things and still realize that we've all done things worthy of death too. I mean, if the truth were known, maybe we haven't done some of the things that we would have been put to death for under the law of Moses. Maybe you've never cursed your parents or struck your parents or committed adultery or murder or blasphemed or some of the other things that people could be, or kidnapped. Those are some of the things that people could be put to death for under the law. Maybe you've never done those things, but you and I know that all of our sins are worthy of death, and for that reason, we're no better than others. And it's not our place, I feel, it's not our place to go out and to be the executioners of wrath against those who do wrong. There are some for whom it is their place, however, and that is the government. It's not the government's place to do something other than that. The government has one role, we have another. But we are to be like Jesus, saying, I can say what you're doing is wrong. I can tell you to sin no more. I can even say your sin is worthy of death, but I don't condemn you. That's not my role to do. There is one, however, who will if you don't repent. It's God's role to condemn. And that's the attitude that we have to have like that of Jesus. And Jesus said, then in verse 12, he spoke to them again, saying, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. Indicating that as he had this attitude, so to follow him and to imitate him, to walk in the light of his teaching and his behavior, is to come out of darkness and to walk in light. The person who walks in darkness quite obviously doesn't see the obstacles before him and is likely to fall. Jesus in another place said, if the Pharisees are blind leaders of the blind, he said if the blind lead the blind, they're both going to fall in the ditch. The reason is because if you're walking in darkness or blind, you can't see what dangers there are in front of you. That passage is Matthew 15:14. Let them alone. Speaking of the scribes and Pharisees, they are blind leaders of the blind. And if the blind leads the blind, both will fall into the ditch. Matthew 15:14, Jesus said. But that same thing happens when people walk in darkness. If people walk in darkness, they don't see where they're going and they stumble. Over in 1 John, this is brought out also. In 1 John chapter 2, it says, verse 8, again a new commandment I write unto you, which thing is true in him and in you, that is in Jesus and in you, because you're imitating him, That new commandment is to love. Because the darkness is passing away and the true light is already shining. He who says he is in the light and hates his brother is in darkness until now. He who loves his brother abides in the light, and there is no cause for stumbling in him. But he who hates his brother is in darkness and walks in darkness and does not know where he is going, because darkness has blinded his eyes. The person who's walking in the light won't have any occasion to stumble, because they can see the obstacles. They won't stumble. The person in darkness will stumble, and they also won't even know where they're going. And John equates that with loving and hating. John says, if you love your brother, you're walking in the light. If you hate your brother, you're walking in darkness. Jesus' reaction to this woman was just the opposite of that of the Pharisees. They hated her. They wanted to kill her. Jesus loved her. He forgave her. He didn't condemn her. He walked in the light. They walked in darkness. And Jesus said, I am the light of the world. He who follows me shall not walk in darkness, but shows the light of life. Stating that his example in this case is to be followed by those who would be followers of him. He that follows me will walk in the light like I have, and will not walk in darkness. They'll not stumble. They will love their neighbor as Jesus exhibited love toward this person. Love, of course, doesn't condemn, but love forgives as much as love can. Well, we're going to stop there.